Secretary General and CEO of the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC. Next to Philippe, we have Luisa Valentin Barros, who is Head of Business Development at WayCarbon and also a member of the Council of Electrotechnical Engineers. Council of Engineers. And then to my immediate right here, Howard Porter, who's former CEO of BEMA in the UK and IEC Market Strategy Board member. So welcome and thank you very much to my three panelists for this discussion. Before we hear from them, I'll just set a little bit of context for what we're going to cover. We've already seen at this COP some ambitious commitments, actually. We've seen a pledge to increase global energy storage capacity 6 times by 2030, aiming for 1,500 gigawatts in total. The pledge also includes upgrading over 80 million kilometers of energy grids by 2040, which of course is critical to supporting renewable energy in existing infrastructure. On the flip side, at the same time, and if you look at Climate Action Tracker's latest report, which is just out, there is in fact no improvement in global warming projections, with current policies still pointing to a 2.7 degree rise in temperatures by 2100. Renewable energy and electric vehicle investments are accelerating, but high fossil fuel subsidies and quadrupled funding for fossil fuel projects are stalling progress. So minimal ambition in 2024 targets and contradictory policy actions are hindering efforts to meet the 1.5 degrees Paris Agreement goal, with a 33% chance of exceeding 3 degrees. These predictions root us back into where we are today. And in fact, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged global bodies this week to invest in climate action, saying we need a massive global effort to steer our world onto a path to safety. You are out in the front, I think that's all of us, helping consumers, investors and regulators understand what credible net zero looks like. So we understand that time is running out. Which means, of course, that working together to move towards a safe, reliable and clean, all-electric and connected society is key. And to help us understand how we get there, we're going to hear from our three panelists. And I'd just like to pose an open question to everyone at the outset. Perhaps if we start with you, Luisa, perhaps you could tell us what the vision of an all-electric and connected society means to you, and what are the benefits and opportunities of working towards that vision?
Can you hear me well? Okay. So thanks for the invitation for IEC to be here. It's a pleasure to represent the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition. We are a group of engineers that advise the Secretary General and is managed by UNIDO and SDSN network. So I think the first point I want to make is that renewables are set to provide more than 1/3 of total electricity generation by early 2025. So it's going to be the first time it will overtake coal. So this is a very important mark. And it's forecasted to rise to 30% by 2026. So very important landmark that we're going to get. Electrification allows us to use more renewable energy, such as solar and wind, and I think it's very key for decarbonization all sectors. So all electric world will allow us to have integrated buildings, transportation and industrial sectors all connected, and this is going to be key for decarbonization. So, and this is also will allow a more energy efficient use of energy. So I think the most important thing is to have everything connected and allow the growth of energy efficiency is one of the key pillars of our commitments made in the last COP and key for us to decarbonize our energy systems.
Thank you, Luisa. So having everything connected is key to realize our climate goals. We turn now perhaps to Philippe. An all-electric connected society is central to the IEC's strategic approach. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how you think we can get to this vision?
Yeah. Yes, it is central, and good afternoon everyone. It's great to be here with you. It is central because the IEC has in its DNA electrotechnology. I mean, we were founded in 1906 on those grounds because we needed to make the use of electricity safe and then of course more efficient and now sustainable. So the all-electric and connected society is not an end in itself, it's a means to an end, and that end of course is that we can have a sustainable world and we can collaborate. We have as the other two elements of our strategy the sustainability and the leadership on collaboration and inclusion, and I think what is fundamental in the context of sustainability for the all-electric and connected society is that we can leverage new technologies, digital technologies for the sustainability goals, and we can only do that in collaboration. And so in a sense we have a virtuous circle here between the sustainability as a core ambition, the leveraging the digital technologies and electricity, moving away from fossil fuels, going to all clean energies, and doing that in conjunction, in collaboration with other partners, other organizations such as ISO here. That's why we have a joint pavilion, and with other organizations of the standards community. And I think that is fundamental for the success, because as much as we are sort of the electrotechnology competence center, if you will, from a standards perspective at heart, we can't do everything on our own. And if we want to be successful on sustainability, we need to collaborate, and we can bring a lot to the table. We probably have an opportunity, James, to speak a little bit more about that afterwards. But very fundamentally, we can bring a lot of know-how to the table that allows us to collaborate together to achieve what COP29 or COP process stands for, namely a sustainable world, and of course a world where we're not damaging the climate by using fossil fuels.
Philippe, thank you very much. I think that's a really important distinction, that an all-electric connected society is not necessarily an end in itself. It's an important stepping stone and prerequisite for where we really need to get to. So Howard, perhaps we come to you now with this same question. What does this vision mean for you, and what are the benefits and opportunities of working towards it?
I think there's an obvious, maybe not so obvious, way in which this can really work in different parts of the world. It's based upon more and more renewables, and let's face it, without more and more renewables, you can't really have a clean electrical system. And certainly, just if I refer to what's been happening in the UK in the last 20 years, there's an index of the mix, what's called the carbon mix. So if you use electricity, what level it's at. And it's steadily been going down, down, down. And as it gets further down, the use of electricity in most parts of our society gets cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. And that's relatively straightforward. More renewables, it means that mix is less and less. It means that using electric heat pumps becomes suddenly much the better way of heating homes. It means electric cars are suddenly a lot better than fossil fuel cars. So this electric future is based, and has to be based, on renewables, arguably with some nuclear in there, because it's difficult in some markets to see without that. Just speak to the people in the other zone from the fusion industry. Well, yeah, some of us will be around in 2050, I might not be, but in 2050 we may well be looking at fusion providing that basis. I'm not convinced personally, but we'll see. And it's also a realization to make all these different electrical equipment work together. It is impossible to make it work without using digital technology. And I can give you a very brief example here. If you have, in a home environment, photovoltaics on the roof, a battery in the garage, an electric car on the street, and a heat pump somewhere else, and I've got a house like that, how does it work? How do you operate that building, particularly when you've got electricity coming in from a grid? So you have to have a contract with an energy company. How do you make that work? And I probably know more than most about how to make it work, and I'm sure we're not doing it correctly. And therefore you do need digital help, probably AI help, in AI in the context of it can analyze all the data and do something for you, rather than ruin the world, as many people say. But a combination of proper AI and proper digital intertwined with all those electrical appliances, you can get genuinely to a zero carbon system. But we need to repeat what Philippe has said, you have to collaborate across sectors as well as across the world.
That's fascinating. As you were explaining some of that and how it translates into our normal day-to-day lives, I was thinking that I don't actually have any of those things that you mentioned in my house that you seem to have a lot of. And I'd like to try something actually here. So you talked about heat pumps, an electric car, photovoltaic panels. Was there anything else?
Batteries.
Batteries. So I'd just like to ask, how many people in the audience here have 2 or more of those things in their house? You do. 1, 2 people out of several. So I think that potentially highlights the problem that belongs to us actually to fix. So it's up to us to sort of take that forward to some degree, isn't it? Or do we need quality to improve first?
Well, probably what's needed around the world is an investment environment. But as I think 1 or 2 days ago, I can't remember how long ago, there was a session here about financing the electrification. So you need to bring together the financing role, which, as people who are here at that session would realize, you don't get finance without the security of having standards and accreditation and all the other good aspects of that. So probably the reason why not many hands went up is that wherever you're from in the world, the incentives from your government and the financing hasn't been there to be able to you to make that decision to change your property. But when that's available, a lot can be done. And again, that's when the problems come about, how you make it all work together. And there's one final thing before I stop hogging the system here. If you go into the grids, the more and more renewables on the grid, and the more houses like mine there'll be on the grid needs to be digital, because the electricity grids around the world were built with static energy at each end. Lots of power stations, a finite number of power stations and a lot of endpoints. Well, now it's changing. There'll be thousands, if not millions, of generation points and millions of endpoints using energy at different times of day. Therefore, the energy system as a whole needs to be digitized as well as our homes.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, Louisa, do you want to come in?
Just to add to what Gord said, I think it's very important we have incentives, right, to change user behavior. So when we ask people about batteries, solar energy, I think we need to consider that for consumers to change their energy use behavior, we need to have incentives for that as well. Not only incentives in terms of subsidies, but also incentives in terms of policies like demand-side management and things like that, which will be key for this electrification for the net zero transformation.
Yeah. So, in summary of this section of the conversation, we need finance, we need incentives, but then it needs us to step up to the challenge and react to those incentives and to take the reins. Excellent. So that is now on my to-do list firmly after COP. So coming back to the electric grids, Louise, I want to ask you about, you have a lot of experience in large-scale projects when it comes to electrification, and what are the key measures we need to take to decarbonize grids or the energy sector at large? Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so for us to have decarbonized grid, we need more renewable energy. For more renewable energy, as we think about solar and wind that are intermittent by nature, we need more flexibility for the grids. More flexible grids means grids that are designed digitally, and also that has storage. We also need extended grids. We need more transmission capacity for being able to connect renewable energy, and we need to adapt the existing infrastructure for this new grid that we are talking about. And that requires standards, that require technology, and that's important. And the last thing I want to talk about is the incentives that I mentioned before. So these are necessary for us to have this grid transformation and allow us to have more renewable energy connected.
Thank you. Strangely, for a panel that's taking place on the Standards Pavilion, we haven't talked about standards yet. So I'd like to come to Philippe to ask, where do standards come into this equation? And what role do they, plus conformity assessment, have in enabling the key clean energy infrastructure in an increasingly digital society?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, of course, standards should come in as soon as possible. We just heard about the relationships that we have between different factors. We heard about financing. We heard, and we, by the way, see, for instance, if the World Bank puts out calls for tenders for projects that require electric technology, they like to reference our standards because that's a solid base also for the financing community. They know that they would invest, at least technically, from a solid perspective. I mean, there's still, of course, the financing or the venture risk. But really, standards should come in as soon as possible. And we, I think, agree also with our partners, with ISO, with ITU, in particular, not least in the context of the Green Digital Action that ITU has launched, and that was endorsed this morning in the ministerial roundtable as well, that in a sense, standards, they should be sustainable by design. So of course, if you look at this from a perspective of sustainability and also combating climate change, we should make sure we get the standards as soon as possible into the system, and we have standards that are conceived in a way at the root, at the heart, that is fit for sustainability and fit for protecting the environment and the climate. And that is, of course, more easily said than done, because you have existing mechanism, you have existing interest, you have vested interest sometimes, and ultimately we are a voluntary organization, I mean, based on members who voluntarily come together and produce voluntary standards, which become global standards and are used by all stakeholders, not only the industry, but also regulators, for instance. But we're still at the heart, a bottom-up organization. And I think that is also a challenge which we need to address, that we can make sure that more sustainability by design is injected in the standardization machinery. And I would not want to neglect at this point also the aspect of conformity assessment, because we are one of the few, if not the only, standards development organization that runs also conformity assessment systems. And of course, there you can try to design standards in a way that makes it easier to assess them later on. But of course, in the food chain, so to say, conformity assessment comes when the standard has been implemented, and you have to assess products, goods and services in the electrotechnology field against those conformity assessment aspects. And so I think that as well should be taken into account as early as possible, so that you don't suddenly end up with something that you actually can't certify, because the design is such, from a standards perspective, that it's hardly possible to prove that you're on the right path.
So integrate standards as soon as possible, recognize the value of...
James?
Sorry,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
I was just summarizing some of what Philippe said. Recognize the value of standards in de-risking investments, and standards by and sustainability by design. And you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to reinforce what Philippe just said with two examples. So at the Council, we discussed a lot about regional grid integration and how this is important for the electrification and for the net zero carbon world. And if you analyze, for example, in the Caribbean, we had an integrated grid for 9 countries. But this agreement took 9 years to be signed, 10 years to be signed. And one of the things that make it so difficult is the different standards each country have in their electric grids. So I think this is a key point for the electrification. And another example that I want to provide here is we are now approving in Brazil the offshore wind regulation. And because of the lack of standards, the lack of approval of this regulation, we are having private investment being delayed. So I think this is a very important topic. I just want to reinforce with regional examples.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luisa, for the regional examples. And in fact, I was going to come to you anyway, Howard, about that and what needs to happen at national level.
Well, I think the examples here is that I think has been said in a number of forums in the last 2 or 3 days, is that the best practice from, for example, to pick up what was just said about offshore wind, the standards used in the UK or in China, where there are thousands of existing wind turbines, are covered by standards. Now, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure they're covered by IEC standards. Well, I think the best way then to take it forward is for any of those developers to look towards, is there an international standard that this can be based upon? Because if you've had a program already happening in those major countries, I'm very, very sure there are international standards covering that technology. And similarly, back to the examples I gave in terms of an all-electric building, all the standards are not there yet for that scenario. And one of the things I'm trying to do with IEC is trying to get some work on some of those standards. But once we've got a proper standard about how digitally you make these things work together, well, that goes into the IEC, and then it's available for anybody in the world to pick that up. So if there was a project in Brazil to electrify homes using some of these technologies, if not all, you just pick up on the work carried out, started off in the UK, elevated to the IEC, and then everyone can take that piece of work. Because the majority of the equipment is going to be the same. A photovoltaic panel and a system is no different in the UK to Brazil, because they are all the same, they work the same way.
They come from China, right?
And they all come from China. Not all, but majority come from China. And similarly, there might not be a heat pump in example in Brazil. It's a little bit warmer than the UK. But there might be an air conditioner equipment. So you add on an air conditioner standard and you connect that to your digital system. So once you've got that working, there should be availability that everyone can use those international standards based on best practice somewhere in the world. And I think that's what we just need to make sure that we in the IEC get that right, and make sure that through, I think, the dissemination programs like this week, the dissemination of that availability is a big challenge, massive challenge. Because I've spoken to a number of people in the last few days, I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know that was available. But so it's a challenge on the IEC and the general standards bodies to make that dissemination of what is available to all the different members of those standards bodies around the world, to make sure that, not to keep using your example, but to use your example again, that you and your colleagues are fully aware of the range of standards and they're packaged together in the right way that will allow you to say, just follow that.
So that feels like a little bit of a gap, or something that could be strengthened. And I think it brings me on to the question that I wanted to come to you, Philippe, on, which is, what's missing from the standards and conformity assessment landscape today to accelerate us towards a smarter all-electric future?
Unfortunately, Howard has already given away half of my goodies, but I really wanted to insist on that, the dissemination aspect, as you call it, Howard, because there are so many standards in our large portfolio, and I'm not just talking about IEC. For instance, we are doing conformity assessment in the hydrogen space based on ISO standards. So we are, of course, try to be as collaborative and inclusive as possible. And there is so much. This is not a reproach to anybody. I mean, as an organization that is not developing standards or involved in conformity assessment, you can't really know all that's going on. I used to work in government before, and it's a classic challenge in government that you have many ministries, and the left ministry doesn't know what the right ministry, I'm not saying left and right politically, but the left hand and the right hand doesn't know what they are doing. They're all doing great things. They all are well-intentioned. They have clear plans, what they have to execute, and the connectivity, the connection of all that is often missing. And that's why, for me, the first element is really dissemination. That's why we're here at the COP. But the COP alone is not enough. We have to make a more permanent channels available to create that dissemination or densify it. And I think that's the first aspect. And the second aspect is, I mentioned the way we're structured, bottom-up, voluntary-based, consensus-based standards, which is also sometimes a bit leaving things a bit to hazard. I mean, it can happen in one way or the other. The famous invisible hand of Adam Smith is maybe not always working in that space of standardization, that everything will somehow fall properly in place. So we're considering this as well, and I know that our chairman of the Standardization Management Board, Vimal Mahendra, who was here this week as well, is very keen on that we are appealing also to our members, to the national committees and their stakeholders, to come with work proposals that take these connections into consideration and that are really sort of designed to address sustainability up front in the first place. Because whatever we do, in one way or the other, we can tie all that to an SDG, we can tie it to SDG 7, but many others as well. And it's good, it helps the mission that we have also in the context of COP. But we have to think how we can be even more deliberate in adding specific new standards to our portfolio that are really even more specifically designed. So I would maybe mention those two main aspects in terms of mechanisms. If we leverage those mechanisms, dissemination and more targeted standardization proposals, work proposals even more, we can be even more impactful when it comes to the objectives of COP.
Excellent. Thank you, Philippe, outlining those two strategies. I think there's some work for the community to do there. In terms of strategies, Louisa, if I can ask, what are the strategies that you see that need to be a focus now to help decarbonize energy initiative intensive sectors such as transport and other areas?
So transport is a very interesting area for us in Latin America. After deforestation, it's the main source of emissions in the region. And we have a big opportunity for us to decarbonize this sector. To decarbonize transport, for example, a strategy is a fuel switch to low carbon fuels, vehicle sharing, right? And also improving energy efficiency on transport. I think this is also very important. But besides we are here in an electrification panel, I think it's important to consider, and giving the example of Brazil, that there is not only a unique solution. So for Brazil, for example, 80% of our cars are flex. So we can use either ethanol or either gas. And also our gasoline in Brazil, it's 30%, 28% mixed with ethanol. So I think this is important to highlight. There is no one solution for all. I mean, EVs are a very important solution, but it's not necessarily what we need, the strategy we need to take everywhere. So I think I just want to highlight this. I think transport is a very key area, but we have other solutions besides electrification.
Thank you. And then Howard, from your perspective, what are the strategies that really need to be a focus? You've talked about buildings, what people have in their homes. What is the most important for us to push on?
Well, I think that as I mentioned before, not to be repeat again, it's about disseminating all information, the best practices. And there are a number of examples around the world that show different solutions. And I can see your point in terms of it's not all the same. But in the majority of the world, we don't have the resources that Brazil has, and therefore it is probably going to be the electric solution. And I think it's really making sure that the end user also gets the information. And that, the IEC cannot do that, I don't think, but it's implicit on governments using the information that comes from the experts, backed up by standards that has been talked about here, to encourage then all citizens to realize they can actually do this. They can actually play a part in doing this. And just to take the example of photovoltaic power, I looked at The Economist about 2 months ago and was amazed to find the front cover of The Economist, "The future is solar." Now, The Economist, as you probably know, is a business magazine, and it's a little bit staid, a little bit boring sometimes. But to have "The future is solar" on the front cover, and then basically it outlined how around the world solar is the cheapest way of delivering energy. Now, flip on that. Why doesn't every home we have here around the world got some photovoltaics? It's the cheapest form of energy. And so I think that example, the standards are there, it works, but there is a lack of dissemination to the public. We are unfortunately in a very difficult situation politically, as we know. We have a US going one way and Argentina going the same way. But hey, the rest of the world can do it. And in fact, people in the US can do it as well. But think about it's the cheap things. Let's get the cheap things, and solar is the cheapest. And evidence has shown once you've got solar, certainly in the UK context, people begin to think, oh, what else can I use with my free power? I've got free power. What do I do? And then suddenly people start thinking about an electric vehicle, or start thinking about an electric heat pump, start thinking about something else. But the key thing is giving the power to the people, of giving them free power through solar energy.
Okay.
And that will be my passing remark on my contribution to COP29.
Yeah, thank you.
Think solar, get it as many places as possible, because that will change people's minds.
So think solar, drive awareness, information is key. Okay.
It's easy,
Excellent.
really.
Yeah, it's easy, really. Even in the UK, it might work. You never know. So just, I'd like to close by coming back onto a point that you made earlier, Philippe. You said that collaboration, which is obviously a watchword for COP, is key. We can't do this alone. Even if the mechanisms and the frameworks for standards exist, we need to collaborate with across the stakeholder groups to make climate action happen. So how should we best do that? What are your thoughts on the best ways to collaborate?
Well, maybe just to be very concrete now, looking into the audience and looking at the panel. I'm really encouraged by seeing that the audience, I think this is one of the younger audiences I've seen this week. And that gives me great hope, because I think most of you here are significantly younger than me, and probably Howard. I'm not talking about Louisa. She's still of the very young generation, although she has a lot of experience. And James is also rather, getting a little bit grayer. So I think for me, that is essential, that we can mobilize the young generation in all sorts of trades, of course engineers, but also non-engineers that collaborate in this space. And the other point I really wanted to acknowledge, I would have made this remark even if you hadn't asked me, James, and I would have jumped in because I wanted to make this. We've heard just now from Louisa an incredible amount of in a very short time, specific examples, her experience, that can help us a lot going forward as well. I have to admit, I didn't know the CEED, the Council of Engineers for Electricity Transition, before I came to the COP29. We had yesterday one of your colleagues from that network as well on a panel, also making a hugely impactful contribution to the discussion, and a very concrete and specific discussion, and that's why I really look forward to working even more also with CET and its many and thankfully also many female engineers who are working on that. So I would leave it at that, not in an anecdotal way, but really I think the younger generation is key, and we of course want to be more inclusive, and the know-how that exists in CET for me is a real discovery this week. So thanks a lot, Louisa, also for having been with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And we will have time for some Q&A in a second, but just want to ask if my panelists here have any final remarks or anything you would like to add to the conversation at this point.
I think the only point I would like to add is that we need to center ourselves in terms of cooperation in the world's problems. So we still have 650 million people without energy access in Africa, and we also have 2 billion people without access to clean cooking. So I think we need at the council, we also looking together at these issues, right? How we can cooperate, how we can leverage what we learn in other regions of the world to solve these problems, because we need to give them access, we need to allow people to have clean cooking access, and this is key for our move to net zero. This is one of the pillars for decarbonizing the energy system.
And I repeat, solar, solar, solar. And a few batteries to make sure you keep the power a bit longer.
Yeah. Well, that's a very clear message to end on. So I'd like to ask now anyone in the audience if they have any questions for any of the panelists up here on anything you've heard today. Yep, we have a question over there. There's a microphone coming round for you.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. So I wanted to ask the panel if they had any thoughts on off-grid solar energy incentivization schemes where it's not connected to the main grid, where it's not connected to the main supplier.
Not me. Can you say
Yep, Howard? Off-grid? Yeah.
I can give more examples about Brazil, which is actually, I think, third or fourth country in terms of distributed generation. They're not off-grid. It's net metering, but I think it's very important to give an example here because we're talking about standards, right? So 12 years ago, we got a very clear and private-led, investor-led regulation, and very well explained in terms of standards, supported by international standards. And now we are talking about 40 gigawatts of solar energy, distributed solar energy, some of them off-grid. Not yet off-grid because we don't have standards for batteries, but it's still a lot. And this is 40 gigawatts. This is almost 20% of the installed capacity of the country. So I think this is key for having consumers to enter in the energy system. And it's going to be key, not only distributed solar, but also mini grids and other solutions to give access to regions such as Africa and other regions that lack the grid extension and needed to provide energy for low income and things like that. So I think this is also a very important solution we need to consider.
I think I would maybe comment, it's almost easier and simpler to do it off-grid because you don't have to worry about the grid connection and what's at the end of the grid. So if you have a situation where you've got an off-grid situation, as long as it is covered by the relevant standards, and that we can't emphasize that enough, because if it doesn't work. And we had an example earlier in the week about situations in Kenya where the photovoltaic systems stopped working. Well, that's because they weren't installed with the right standards. The connecting wiring perhaps wasn't correct. The batteries were not to the standard. But if you have the right system, it's a sealed, looped system. And it can be a small one or a big one. And the benefit is you can actually standardize the whole installation. And it probably, so I think that definitely is the solution, I would say, for a lot of off-grid communities around the world because it provides quite a lot of energy. You know, it's not megawatts, but quite a lot of energy sufficient for a community or a village. But it doesn't have to be connected to the grid. And in some cases, it's easier to do it that way.
Yeah. The off-grid conversation also makes me think very much of the IEC's own work in its Global Impact Fund, which of course harnesses both the standards and the conformity assessment, the value in that to avoid solar graveyards and to bring life back into sort of otherwise defunct batteries, thereby avoiding e-waste and getting these systems back online. And the Global Impact Fund is ramping up its work to connect off-grid communities in exactly that kind of way, and in Kenya and other places, as you've mentioned. I don't know, Philippe, if you wanted to add anything to that? Time? Yep. So any more questions? We've got one over here. There's a microphone. Yeah, thank you.
Not another panel, unfortunately.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think this one question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you very much. We were talking about Africa. We know that the gap in access to energy is why, is essentially in Africa, in developing world in general. In Senegal, we were doing an analysis on the state of the industry, and one of the key findings was the cost of energy. So we are exploring ways of utilizing renewable energy like solar. What would you recommend? What three key aspects of it could you tell me to consider?
Okay.
Into that perspective.
So very quickly.
Just to make sure I understood you right, three key aspects to consider for Africa in terms of energy access?
For industry.
For the industry, I think regulation, incentives, and a deep understanding of what the requirements of the specific industries that you have there. So is the problem heat, is the problem electrification, is what type of industry you're talking about? So if you understand the specific requirements, we can have policies and specific regulation for decarbonize the local industry.
Thank you. We are going to have to end there, I'm afraid. This has been a great discussion. Thank you, everybody on the panel, and thank you, the audience. Thank you very much.